Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I've spent the past 20 years trying to solve a range of tough problems. With my colleagues and others, I've worked on climate change in my native country of Canada, on the transition away from apartheid in South Africa, on child malnutrition in India, on the civil war in Guatemala, on healthcare in the United States, and many other complex and conflictual issues in different parts of the world. And when I reflect on this work, I notice the following pattern. Those of us who are trying to solve tough economic and social and environmental problems very often find ourselves stuck. And we find ourselves stuck for three reasons. First of all, we can't make progress on the problems we're trying to solve within the context as it is now. It's too unstable or unfair or unsustainable. At the same time, we cannot transform the context in which we are on our own or working just with our friends and colleagues. These contexts are too complex to be grasped or shifted by any one individual or organization or sector. And finally, the people who we would need to engage in order to collectively shift these contexts don't understand or agree with or trust one another. When we find ourselves in such stuck situations, how can we get unstuck and move forward? 16 years ago, I was invited to come to the country of Colombia by two people who were trying to help their country get unstuck and move forward. There's a young businessman and philanthropist named Manuel Jose Carvajal and a journalist and politician named Juan Manuel Santos. They managed to organize a meeting, a big meeting, with leaders from across the society to talk about how is it possible to move forward, and in particular, could the experience that I had been involved in South Africa be relevant in Colombia. I remember there being a big fuss about one man who had shown up that people didn't know what to do with. I later found out it was a very notorious and feared member of the paramilitary, and I only recently heard the story that a woman who was a communist member of the city council went to Juan Manuel Santos, the young politician who had organized the meeting, and said, "How do you expect me to sit down at a table with this man who has tried to have me assassinated 5 times?" And he said to her, "Madam, it is in order to avoid a 6th attempt that I invite you to take your seat." There were a number of speakers, academics, peace negotiators, and I gave a talk about my experience some years before in South Africa. The conference or the meeting was being broadcast to the illegal guerrillas who were in the hills outside of Bogota. And at the end of my talk, somebody's cell phone rang, and it was one of the guerrillas who had a question for the speaker. "Mr. Kahane, do we have to agree to a ceasefire in order to participate in the scenario workshops you're discussing?" And people looked at me as though I was, supposed to know what the answer to this question was. And I gave what I thought was the right answer, and I think it was the right answer, which is no, there are no preconditions. What is necessary is to be willing to come and to talk and to listen. after some months of effort by a convening group that was established at that meeting, the project that became known as Destino Colombia, Destination Colombia, was organized. And a group of 36 leaders from across Colombia were invited to participate in this conversation about the future of the country. The government was willing to grant safe passage for the guerrillas to come to the workshops, but they didn't think it would be safe in spite of the very heavy security at the workshop venue, a beautiful rural retreat center outside of Medellin. So they ended up participating in three-day meetings, 9 long days of meetings by speakerphone. The ELN from a maximum security prison at Itagüí, and the FARC from a secret location in Costa Rica. This was a remarkable group to talk. These were people who had never had a conversation like this before. People were both excited, I was excited, and also frightened. Early on, somebody came to me at a break and said, Adam, we're actually quite frightened to be talking to these people. Who knows what would happen to us if we said the wrong thing. And so when the meeting resumed, I raised this issue in the group as a whole. I said, somebody's told me that they find this encounter frightening. And Francisco Galan, who was one of the ELN people in jail, said, Mr. Kahane, why are you surprised that people in this room are frightened? People everywhere in Colombia are frightened. And so this idea that in some sense, the dynamic that we were trying to understand and work with in the larger system was present in the smaller system. And the group developed a set of ground rules for their work together, amongst others that nobody would be killed for anything they said in the meeting. I mean, outside the meeting, usual rules applied. But in addition to that people would speak frankly, that they would be concise, that they would not personalize things. And if you look at the report of the Destino Colombia group, they were as proud of the ground rules they had established to create this safe space as they were of the substantive work they did on the future of the country. After these 3 meetings, the group came up with or agreed a set of scenarios, a set of stories about how the violence in Colombia could be or might unfold. They were all given the names of well-known proverbs or sayings in Spanish, but the English names were, the first one was called Tomorrow Will Come and We'll See, a story of really continuing to push off the difficult work and the situation in the country continuing to deteriorate and disintegrate. There was a scenario of a negotiated solution between the government and the guerrillas, called, in English, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, that a compromise where everybody gave something up would be a way to end the violence. There was a scenario where that compromise didn't work, and in frustration, the populace elected a government that attempted to resolve the conflict through military force, through pacification, and that scenario was called Everybody March. And then a 4th scenario that people weren't too sure about, of a bottom-up resolution of the conflict through civil society called Unity Makes Strength. The group did not at all agree on which of these scenarios were probable or which were preferable, but after much debate and argument, they agreed that these were 4 things that might happen. And then nothing, or at least nothing that was visible to me from outside the country. I really never heard anything about it. There was an academic article written by a political scientist at University of Los Andes saying that people had been affected personally by the encounters, but that it had not really rippled out beyond them. There was a UN report on the project the title of which was A Treasure Still to be Discovered. So I thought, well, this had been an amazing encounter, a historic encounter, and yet it had not really made an impact. I went back in 2007, 10th anniversary of the project, happy to see my old friends, and I had lunch with a well-known Colombian intellectual, Antanas Mocas, who was the two-time mayor of Bogota, a brilliant thinker, a brilliant activist, presidential candidate, and I was flabbergasted by what he asked me at lunch. He said, "Adam, do you realize that we have been living these scenarios exactly as they have been written, one after the other? We had this period of tomorrow will come and we'll see. Then we had the attempted negotiation under President Pastrana, I think it was, that looked like it was going to lead to a solution, but then it fell apart. In frustration, the President Uribe was elected. His militarization of the conflict was word for word what was in the text. At first I thought he was joking. I said, this is, it's just coincidence. These are stories. This was work in a workshop. It's, you don't really believe that these are being enacted deliberately one after the other. This year I went back to Colombia. My book, Power and Love, had been translated into Spanish. The president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, who had been the young politician 16 years before, kindly launched the book in Bogota, and I was surprised to learn that in his recounting of the history of Colombia over these 6 years, he took more or less exactly the position of Mocas. He said, these scenarios were not academic, they were prophetic. He said, it is good to know that the best scenario we imagined 16 years ago is beginning to be realized. And framed his whole political project and the whole platform of his government in terms of in unity makes strength. The final piece of the story is on this same visit in February of this year, I met Francisco Galan, the ELN guerrilla who had been on the telephone for those 9 days, who had since been released from prison, was involved in various peace activities. And he said, the problem we have is that we keep telling the same stories and we keep producing the same actions. We're addicted to our old stories. We need new stories. So my conclusion from this experience is that telling new stories can sometimes generate new realities. What I realize that we have built up through these experiences is a new methodology for getting unstuck and for moving forward. We call this transformative scenario planning. It involves simply telling stories about what might happen, not stories about what will happen, not forecasts, not stories about what should happen, not proposals or visions or positions, but stories about what might happen. Relevant, challenging, plausible, clear stories about what might happen. And in this way, building new understandings and new relationships and new intentions and hence new actions. But the other thing I've learned is that although this methodology is simple, it is really not easy. First of all, in working in this way, we are trying not only to implement an idea or a way forward that we already have, but together to discover a way forward. One of the features of complex, conflictual, problematic situations is there is agreement neither on the solution nor even on the problem. This is above all an emergent process, which means it's not predictable and it's not controllable. And for many people, including for me, who like knowing where we're going and like being in control about where we're going, This feels uncomfortable and difficult and risky. The second way in which it's not easy is that it requires us to work not only with our friends and colleagues, but also with strangers and opponents. We're working on effecting transformations that we are unable to effect alone or just with our people. But if you work not just with friends and colleagues, but with strangers and opponents, you will find yourself in real conflict, deep conflict. And for people like me who like things to be rational and nice, this feels deeply uncomfortable and difficult and risky. And the final way in which it's not easy, and this is the most fundamental of all, is that we're working here not simply to adapt to an unpredictable world. We're working in this way to transform a situation which is fundamental, which we find to be unacceptable, unstable, unsustainable. In this way, transformative scenario planning takes conventional scenario planning and turns it exactly on its head. And what's required is exactly the discernment which Reinhold Niebuhr pointed to in this very famous invocation, Lord, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And this here is where the real difference between advisors and actors comes into the story. There's that joke that what's the different contribution of the chicken and in a ham omelet, what's the difference in the contribution of the chicken and the pig? The chicken is involved, the pig is committed. And this is the big difference if you're trying to affect systemic transformation between being an observer, an advisor, and being an actor. Are you willing to be committed? And for many people, including people like me, who are used to standing on the sidelines, this is profoundly uncomfortable and difficult and risky. But these days, it is exactly this stretching, this uncomfortable, difficult, risky stretching that is needed of us. This is how we can create better futures. Thank you very much.